Tennessee. Welcome to Mike.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mike. I'm an alcoholic. And man, I'm having fun. I don't know about y'all, but I'm having a blast. This is just awesome. It's good to see everybody. How many of y'all were here last night? Okay, well, I won't tell you all about me then. You heard enough of that last night. I fell in love with AA history early on. I was like scatterbrained. I could barely string two sentences together, but I could read, and I'm grateful for that. And I was given a big book on my first night, and I was given a 12 and 12 on my second night, and I was told it's a 12 and 12, so read the second half. I never got that bias that I wasn't supposed to like the traditions. You know, like you go to meetings sometimes and you hear somebody say, oh, man, if I'd have known it was a traditions meeting, I wouldn't have come, and everybody laughs. Man, don't do that. That's bad, because the new people, they're looking for cues. And if they think, oh, I guess I'm not supposed to like their traditions, then they'll start doing that same thing. Oh, if I'd have known it was a traditions meeting, I wouldn't have come. But I didn't know that. And I went to step meetings. And most of the meetings I went to, when we got through the steps, we did a block of traditions. But when I was reading the traditions in the book, I mean, even before that, when I was reading the big book and I was reading Bill's story and Dr. Bob's story, I just got wondering, who are these guys? I want to learn more about them. And they hadn't written Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers or Pass It On. There wasn't that plethora of Bill W. books and all the great history books that are available today. It just wasn't available. There was, in 1975, a guy named Frank Thompson wrote the first of what would become a plethora of Bill W. books. And in my opinion, it's still the best, and it's the original, and it's his official biography, no offense to Pass It On. He was the only one of all of these Bill W. authors that actually worked with Bill for many years with the understanding that he was going to be his biographer. So I had that, and I had AA Comes of Age, and that was about it. Had the traditions and the stories in the back of the big book, and that was about it. But I just fell in love with this thing, and I got curious, well, how did these two guys meet? I mean, because, you know, you start thinking, man, if these two guys didn't meet, guess what? I'm going to say this a lot today, and if you can catch on, you think I'm about to say it, feel free to join in. I'm going to say, we're not sitting here today. If them two guys didn't meet, we're not sitting here today. That's just all there is to it. So I've been doing this presentation for about 10, 12 years, something like that. And I was inspired by Gail Elf. She was the original archivist in Akron, Ohio, where I'm sure some of you are familiar with who she is. And they were doing a fundraiser up in Long Island for Dr. Bob's house. And the draw for me was Mel B. He was speaking, and I read some of his books, and I really liked him. And I thought, you know, that guy ain't getting any younger. This might be your only chance to meet him and talk to him and hear him tell his story. And, oh, by the way, the archivist from Akron is going to be there doing some little presentation on the writing of the big book or something. Well, anyway, I just fell in love with her in that presentation. It was wonderful, and I thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to dust off my PowerPoint skills, and I'm going to see if I can do that. And I told her that. So she knows. But I want to give her credit for being my inspiration to do this. Anyway, so what we're going to talk about today is the founding moments of Alcoholics Anonymous. This is like pre-AA history. These are the events that led up to the historic meeting of Dr. Bob and Bill. And so that's what we're going to do. So let's get right on into it. Most AA historians, by the way, I'm not an AA historian. I have no initials after my last name. I have no peer-reviewed research that has been published that is original to me. I'm just a guy who loves Alcoholics Anonymous, and I just want to share my love of AA history with anybody I can. And I'm very, very careful to put the information in my presentations is accurate. There's a lot of bad information out there. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So usually when AA historians talk about the founding moments of AA, anybody that knows even a little bit about AA history knows that there's dozens and dozens of things that absolutely had to happen or we're not sitting here today. Well, we don't have time to talk about dozens and dozens, and you're thinking, man, this thing's like an hour and a half long. We're going to take a break, don't worry. And this is a brief history. It's a brief history. It's a brief history of Alcoholics Anonymous. But most historians point to these four events as being the most important four founding moments. The interaction with Dr. Carl Jung and a really bad drunk named Roland Hazard, Ebby's visit to Bill, Bill's spiritual experience, and Bill and Dr. Bob meet. So let's get acquainted with our principal characters for a minute, because not everybody knows. There may be some newer people here. Of course, that's Bill W. on the left and Dr. Bob on the right. And one of the first things I like to point out is their age difference. Dr. Bob was 16 years older than Bill. Bill was just a lad of 39 when he got sober. Dr. Bob was drinking before Bill ever had his first drink. So there's a little difference there. We think of Dr. Bob as the stern Midwesterner. If it ain't broke, let's don't fix it. Slow your roll there, Billy. And we think of Bill as kind of like the New York City guy, kind of a hustler. You know, maybe a little shaky sometimes. An idea a minute does everything at 100 miles an hour. There's a little bit of truth to both of those things, but the fact is they were both from Vermont, and they had some similarities. Bill was born in East Dorset, Vermont. It's a little town there. The house he was born in has been totally restored, and the house he grew up in across the churchyard is now where they store a lot of archival material. If you haven't been there, please carve some time out and go on up there and visit. They're really, really great people up there. Bill wouldn't call his father an alcoholic, so I won't. But his drinking wasn't normal, I'll put it that way. And his drinking did break up his marriage. Bill was born, his people owned a tavern and an inn. And Bill was actually born in a room behind a bar, so that's pretty fitting. And his father's drinking led his parents to split up. His people worked the marble quarries of the Green Mountains. On his mother's side, there were some educators and attorneys and things like that. So when Bill's father left, he had a younger sister named Dorothy, who he liked very much, and they were very close. After Bill's father left, when he was like elementary school age, his mother went off to Boston to school and left Dorothy and Bill to be raised by their maternal grandparents, who were really good people. Bill and Dorothy loved him, and they did a really great job, but they weren't his parents. And, we know a lot from Bill's readings, the less than, and if they loved me, they wouldn't have split up and all that kind of stuff, so I must not be worthy. He had a lot of anxiety and worry and stuff, and he would struggle in school, but he would eventually graduate. He would serve honorably in World War I, and that's when he started drinking. He would move on to Wall Street. He would earn a fortune and lose it twice. And, of course, he became a chronic alcoholic and was destined to be one of the co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. Dr. Bob was born, maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours north of East Dorset in a little town called St. Johnsbury. In the house that he was born in, you can actually visit. At one time, it was an IOP, and I couldn't believe it. I went up there, and I was taking some pictures, and a guy comes out, and he says, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm just a history guy. I'm taking pictures. He goes, you want to lead the meeting? And I said, why, yes, I do. So I had been in the house Bill was born in the night before at a big book meeting, and then the next day at noon, I was leading a noon meeting up in the house that Dr. Bob was born in. They don't have the resources that Dr. Bob's house in Akron has, so it's, they do the best they can. But he was born up there in St. Johnsbury. His father was a judge in Caledonia County. They were a well-respected family. His mother was very, very strict and very religious. He had an older foster sister that we don't know much about, other than that he was very fond of her, but she was so much older, that basically he was raised as an only child. And he was forced to go to church all the time, and he really hated it. He couldn't stand it. And he vowed, this from reading his story, he vowed that as soon as he was out from under parental supervision, he would never darken the doors of another church. I think he was serious about it, man. He didn't go back for like 40 years. Both men were very athletic, and they loved the outdoors, hunting and fishing and all that stuff. Dr. Bob was an excellent swimmer, and Dr. Bob and the good old timers, they say something about him saving a girl's life at one point. They don't really elaborate on it. He would work the hotels in the Adirondacks as a bellhop. And he would struggle through college. He would struggle through medical school, but eventually did get his medical degree and started a private practice in Akron, Ohio. And he was a chronic alcoholic destined to be one of the co-founders of AA. So that's just a little tiny, tiny thumbnail sketch of our two principal characters. Founding moment number one, the interaction between Carl Jung and Roland Hazard. I was at a AA history thing once, and I stepped in it. I said, Carl Jung. Oh my God, you thought those guys were going apoplectic, if I'm saying that right. They said, it's Jung. I said, Jung, come on, man. He said, it's Jung. So I'm just letting y'all know, it's Jung. So Roland H., we always use like his last initial, like as if he was never an AA member, but his name was Roland Hazard. So we're going to talk about the interaction between those two men. And we know about it. He's that certain businessman that they talk about in the big book. Roland was born in Peacedale, Rhode Island in 1881. He was born into a wealthy family, a powerful family, politics, big business. He was a Yale guy, a hard worker, crazy smart, and he was a chronic alcoholic. Carl Jung, we don't need to talk too much about. Most everybody knows who he is. He's one of these iconic figures in modern psychology. He had 8 uncles that were ministers. His father was a minister, and he had 8 uncles that were ministers. So that'll be important in a minute. And so Roland would seek Dr. Jung out to help him with his drinking. So let's talk about AA urban legend for just a second. There's a lot of it out there. I don't know if y'all ever heard this one. I used to hear this all the time. And when I tell it now, people just look at me like, nah, I never heard that. But anyway, I used to hear it all the time. They'd say, Bill Wilson was asked one time if he could change one word, just one word in the big book, what would it be? And Bill thought about it, and he said, I would have changed rarely to never. Woo! Oh, man, I mean, it almost gives me goosebumps. You know, it's a great story. The only problem is it's not true. There's like zero evidence of that ever happening. Bill never said that. In fact, he was asked point blank once at a general service conference if he had said that, and he said no. You know, anybody that's seen a pre-publication of the manuscript knows, man, they got all kinds of stuff crossed out and put in there. But imagine this, what if they meant what they said and they said what they meant, and that's what got into print in the first edition. So that's one AA urban legend. Another one I used to hear all the time is that when Roland was seeking help for his drinking, he really, really, really wanted to see Sigmund Freud. You know, but Freud was busy, so he had to settle for Dr. Jung. Now, the wow factor in all of that is that Sigmund Freud was not a spiritual guy. He thought that God was just this fantasy in our infantile minds of a need for a father figure. So he wasn't a spiritual guy. Carl Jung, on the other hand, he was a spiritual guy. Maybe not like me or you, but he was a spiritual guy. So the wow factor is, oh my God, what if Freud wasn't busy and he was able to see Freud? We'd have never got our spiritual solution. Maybe we wouldn't be here today. Great story, really makes you think, boy, we dodged a bullet early in our history. Problem with that is, it didn't happen. It didn't happen. A couple of really smart people, 10 times smarter than me, got more brains in their little fingers than I'll ever hope to have, and they do have a lot of initials after their names, independently wanted to do some investigating to see if there was any truth that Roland Hazard tried to see Sigmund Freud first and then kind of had to settle for Carl Jung. There is zero evidence. I mean, they went through the Hazard family papers, trip manifest, financial records, everything they could find. There is absolutely no record of Roland ever trying to reach out to Sigmund Freud. And conversely, there were other members of Roland's family that had a personal relationship with Dr. Jung who had been under his care at various times. So until somebody can come up with this thing called evidence, you know, we're going to have to chalk that up as AA urban legend. There's so many AA history books out there today. Some of them are very, very good. They're very well researched. I mean, you can believe everything you read in there. And unfortunately, there's a lot of books out there that they're not worth the paper they're printed on. And we have to be careful when we're reading these AA history books. We have to look at source notes. Any AA history book that doesn't have source notes, it's like, I don't know about that. I read something in an AA history book. I won't mention the author's name. And I saw something I had never seen before. Now, I don't know everything there is to know about AA history, but this was kind of big. And so I reached out to the author, and I contacted him. And I said, I was nice as I could be, and I said, it's really interesting. Where did you learn that? And so he gave me his source. His source was another book that he had written. That was his source. I'm like, oh, this ain't working. So anyway, I'm just as a roundabout way of saying, please be careful about what there's so much information floating out there that is either flat out not true or it is so taken out of context and exaggerated and based on hearsay that it's just not credible. And so we need to be careful about that. So when did this happen? The people that were doing the research to find out if Roland ever tried to see Freud Also realized that it didn't happen. We're led to believe in the big book that it happened in the early 30s. It was probably more like the mid-20s. We're also led to believe that he was under the care of Dr. Jung for a year. Turns out it couldn't, just from comparing all these travel records and stuff, it was much less than a year. I don't care. I don't know about y'all, but I don't care when it was. I don't care if it was the mid-20s or the early 30s and it was 2 months or 1 year. It doesn't matter to me. I get around that by saying Roland was under Dr. Jung's care for a time. So what happened? Well, that's what I'm concerned with, is what happened. And we all know this from reading the big book. He's under Dr. Jung's care for a time. And thanks, Doc, I got it. You've been very, very helpful. He's drunk in no time. Back to the good doctor he goes with his tail between his legs. And he says, why can't I stop? He begged the doctor to tell him the whole truth. I love this part. And he got it. In the doctor's judgment, he was utterly hopeless. He could never regain his position in society, and he would have to place himself under lock and key or hire a bodyguard if he expected to live long. That's what Dr. Jung told him. Then he would go on to say, excuse me, and this is like your therapist talking to you, right? I mean, this is some pretty harsh language. He goes on to say, you have the mind of a chronic alcoholic. I have never seen one single case recover where that state of mind existed to the extent that it does in you. Of course, Roland fell to so to gates as hell, closed on him with a clang. And then he said something that was very, very important. The bold letters are mine. What if Roland just took that information, slumped his shoulders and said, thanks, Doc, for the bad news, and just walked out of the building? We're not sitting here today. We are not sitting here today. But he asked a very important question, and we're so glad he did. He said, is there no exception? Thank you, Roland, so much. Yes, Dr. Jung replied, exceptions to cases such as yours have been occurring since early times. That's important. AA's of this notion that the alcoholic isn't just physically and mentally sick, but that they're spiritually sick. And as we know, that's what the point of the 12 steps is to bring us to this thing called a spiritual experience, or a spiritual awakening if you prefer. There's recorded cases of chronic alcoholics recovering by spiritual means as far back as the 1700s. We did not invent that. So he says exceptions to yours have been occurring since early times. And then he would call them vital spiritual experiences. He would go on to explain what they were. It is sometimes erroneously reported that Dr. Jung directed Roland to the Oxford group. That's not true. Roland says to Dr. Jung, he says, well, I go to church. And Dr. Jung, being an extremely brilliant man, states the very obvious. He says, well, that's not enough. It's not working. I can't tell you where you got to go to find it, but the only hope you have is a spiritual experience. So I just want to fast forward to 1961. A guy who knew Dr. Jung was over in Europe and just told him one day what his part was, it being the first link in the chain of what would become Alcoholics Anonymous. He didn't know that. And so this guy comes back to the U.S. and he talks to Bill and he says, you should write him a letter. You ought to let him know. And so Bill really never thought about it. So he did. He wrote him a really nice 3-page long letter. He sent him a big book. By that time, the 12 and 12. And AA Comes of Age had been written. And he recounted Roland's story as it was told to him by Roland. And he just says, thank you, here you go. Well, Dr. Jung replied really quick, like within a week. He replied, and I just excerpted, it's a very hard word for me to say, these couple of things because I think it's really, really important. Scholars who study such things connected the dots a long time ago between people who crave alcohol like we do and people who are craving spirituality. And the way Dr. Jung put it, he's talking about Roland, but he could have been talking about any of us. He says his craving for alcohol was the equivalent on a low level of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness expressed in medieval language, the union with God. I'm strongly convinced that the evil principle prevailing in this world leads the unrecognized spiritual need into perdition. I had to look up perdition. It ain't good. But I just love that unrecognized spiritual need. Man, when I was out there drinking and someone comes, son, I bet you're suffering from an unrecognized spiritual need. I'd have looked at him like he had two heads. You see, but that's exactly what was happening. You see, alcohol in Latin is spiritus, and you use the same word for the highest religious experience as well as for the most depraving poison. The helpful formula, therefore, is spiritus contra spiritum. So one of the first stops that Roland made trying to find this spiritual experience, and I'm not trying to sell books here, but there was an outfit called the Emmanuel Movement in Boston. In the very early 1900s, they had a spin-off called the Jacoby Club. It's the closest thing to AA that I have ever read about. It was non-professionals, no money changing hands, and the recovery was based on spiritual principles. And in 1909, when the Jacoby Club spun off from the Emmanuel Movement, they met in the basement of that church, the Emmanuel Church in Boston, in 1909. In 1909. And so I went to the Boston Intergroup and put the address in for that church. You know what? There's still a meeting there. There's still a meeting there. Can you imagine that? I was doing this presentation in Texas, and there was a dude there from Boston. He says, I've been to that meeting. I've been to that meeting. Just imagine that. It's just inconceivable. So that was the closest thing to Alcoholics Anonymous that I've ever read about. The problem with the Emmanuel Movement and the Jacoby Club is they lasted a long time, but they were very local. They just weren't growing. They weren't growing. I mean, they didn't have a Bill W. to kind of, we need to get the word out. So that wasn't at that same time, well, actually a little later, there was an outfit that's commonly referred to as the Oxford Group. I'm not an Oxford Group expert. I really don't have any desire to be. My interest in the Oxford Group is only insofar as its relation to the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. But what was known as the Oxford Group was started by a man named Frank Buchman. He was a Lutheran minister born in Pennsylvania in 1878. And he had a boys' home in Philadelphia that he was very passionate about. And churches, being churches, they got budgets and they had to axe the program. And when the administrators gave him that bad news, he had a fit. I mean, he said, no, you can't do that. He was passionate about this project. And he stomped his feet and he did everything he could to try to change their minds, but they weren't budging. There is no money for this. It ain't happening. It ain't happening. So he just walked away. He was filled with such a resentment that in 1908, he wound up going all the way to England, and they had a thing called the Keswick Convention once a year, where it was a gathering of evangelical Christians would get together, and they would have a little conference over a few days. So he went there. He was looking for a particular person whose name escapes me right now, but he never did run into them. But what happened to him was he heard a woman named Jessie Penn Lewis give a talk, and it was a powerful talk. Jessie Penn Lewis was a little bitty thing about this high. She was very frail health most of her life, but she was an incredibly powerful speaker. She could just spellbind a whole room. And he heard her give a talk called The Power of the Cross, and he was sitting in the back of the hall, and he literally had a spiritual experience right there. And he knew that his resentment was killing him. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And he knew he had to forgive those administrators and move on, and that's what he did. He wrote all the administrators letters saying he forgave them, which I'm sure they were like really happy. Well, I'm really glad you forgave us, but please, we don't ever want to see you again. And years later, in 1918, 1920, around in there, he ran into a young man named Sam Shoemaker, Reverend Sam Shoemaker. He was born in 1893 in Baltimore. He's Maryland's very own Reverend Sam Shoemaker. He's a great guy. The church he's buried in is maybe 6-7 miles outside of Baltimore. It's not really close to my house. It's about an hour from where I live. But I go there maybe once or twice a year. I run over there and usually take some people with me, and we stop in the graveyard and pay our respects to Sam and his wonderful wife, Helen. And then we go into the AA meeting, and I'm telling you, it's just a little bit better. You know, it's just so awesome to know that history is right there. So he meets a young Sam Shoemaker in China, and Sam had been sent there to start some YMCAs, and he was really sputtering, just not doing very well at all. And he was starting, his church is starting to put some pressure on him. Hey, what are you doing? You know, we're going to yank you back. You're not doing a good job. And so he started getting some resentments. What better person to run into than Frank Buchman? And so Frank sort of mentored him. And some people consider Sam to be like a co-founder of the Oxford Group. I don't really myself, but some do, and that's your business. The Oxford Group, Frank had this, he had a vision. He was of the opinion that the world was spiritually sick, not something I disagree with, and that what the world needed was a conversion experience. Now, that's thinking pretty big. I mean, we're just trying to help the next alcoholic that comes along. He wants to convert the world. That was Frank's plan. So originally they were called the First Century Christian Fellowship. In 1928, part of Frank's strategy was he thought, if I can get to the wealthy, the powerful, the people who are in a position of influence, I can cast a wider net. That was his strategy. And then he kind of smartly thought, I'll get to the leaders of the future as well. So he set up these first century Christian fellowship meetings on Ivy League campuses all around the country and the world. The Oxford group actually had no affiliation with Oxford University, but there were first century Christian fellowship meetings going on there. A group of Oxford students went to South Africa to help fight racism, and the local press followed them around for a while, and they just started referring to them as the Oxford group, and the name just kind of stuck. Oops, not finished. In 1938, because the Oxford group did not have a 10th tradition, they became known as Moral Rearmament. I'll tell you all about that later if you want. And in 2001, they became Initiatives of Change, which some people are surprised to hear they're still around. Yes, they are. They've sort of lost their Christian flavor, but they're all about, nation building and peace and all of that. I was giving this presentation in Richmond, and the local archives guy comes up to me and says, do you know where their U.S. headquarters is now? And I said, no, I haven't got a clue. Never really thought about it. He says, about 2 blocks from here. And sure enough, it was. So if anybody asks you, you know where their headquarters is. It's in Richmond, Virginia. So this is where Roland would find his spiritual experience enough to gain sobriety. It's thought that Roland's sobriety over his lifetime was not uninterrupted, but it is also believed that he died sober. Right at the end of World War II. He lost 2 sons in World War II. I can't even imagine. Founding moment number 2, Ebby's visit to Bill, Brooklyn, New York. I used to say, I can't find any age-appropriate pictures of Ebby. He's either like really young, and what I used to say was or really old, like he is in this picture. I don't say that anymore because he's 10 years younger than I am in this picture. So I say a mature Ebby. So if anybody has some, quality pictures of Ebby, like when he's in his 30s or 40s, hook a brother up, would you? I could use it. So this is Bill and Ebby at International in 1955. Ebby came from Albany, New York. He came from an extremely wealthy family. Big business, politics. His father was mayor of Albany. Later, his brother would become mayor of Albany. He had another brother that ran for Congress. I mean, they were a big deal. They were also pretty much a family of alcoholics, but Ebby was the worst of them. So how did Ebby and Bill meet? Because they're very different people. Well, Bill was struggling in school, and so his grandparents talked to his mother, and they thought it might be a good idea to enroll him in a kind of a hoity-toity prep school called Burr and Burton Seminary at the time, Burr and Burton Academy. It's still there. It still looks just like that. And, Bill didn't like, there were all these rich people that would descend on Manchester in the summertime, and he didn't like them. He called them the summer people. He always felt like they were looking down on him. They always had the best clothes, and he doesn't. His clothes don't fit. And he just felt like they were judging him. Whether they were or not doesn't matter. You know how we do. So he didn't like the summer people. So and a lot of the summer people sent their kids to this school. So you can imagine his delight, when his grandparents tell him, we're going to send you to this school. And even though it was local, he still boarded during the week, and he went home on the weekends. And this is where he would meet Ebby. Ebby was kind of a problem child himself, but nice guy. Everything I've ever read about Ebby tells me he was just like, everybody loved him. He was just the nicest guy in the world, the life of the party. I mean, people you couldn't not like Ebby. Ebby was just an extremely likable guy. And so this is where Bill would meet Ebby, somebody that normally from a class of people that he would be very opposed to and not want to have anything to do with. But Ebby was different. They just became friends right away. They both loved baseball. They played on a baseball team together, so it can't be all that bad. Bill was a pitcher. I don't know what position Ebby played. So this is how Bill and Ebby met. Neither one of them were drinking. Neither one of them were drinking in high school. We're going to fast forward all the way up to the early 30s, but it probably would be nice to fill in a little bit, right? So in 1912, Bill's first love, Bertha Banford, dies unexpectedly, and this would send Bill into a terrible depression. In 1930, Bill and Lois meet. Now, Lois was part of these summer people that would come, so clearly he didn't have a problem with all of the summer people. And Lois's family was friends with Ebby's family. All these wealthy families it was like a little circle. They all knew each other. In 1914, Dr. Bob's hospitalized several times for drinking. Bill hadn't even had his first drink yet, and Dr. Bob's already getting hospitalized for drinking. In 1915, Dr. Bob and Ann are married after a whirlwind 17-year courtship. In 1917, Bill was stationed at Fort Plattsburgh, New York. He was he took the coastal artillery training in Monroe, Virginia, and then he went up to Fort Plattsburgh. And I'll talk about that later. Up at Fort Plattsburgh. Some other people that are interesting to our history were stationed there as well. In 1918, Bill and Lois are married just before he set sail for England in World War I. And he would go to England, and this is where he would have his Winchester Cathedral experience. And that's also when Bill started drinking, is when he joined the service for World War I. In 1928, St. Thomas Hospital opens, and Dr. Bob and Sister Ignatia meet. You know, Sister Ignatia didn't know Dr. Bob was alcoholic till 1939. I don't know how he hid it from her. It's like everybody else knew, but she didn't know. But they had known each other and worked together for a number of years before. In 1929, there was a stock market crash. Bill and Lois lose everything, and they're left deeply in debt. Ebby's family would take a really big hit, too, and right after that, his parents would die. In 1934, Ebby is approached by Oxford Group members in Manchester, Vermont. So meantime, Bill had made a fortune and lost it twice. His drinking was totally out of control. As was Dr. Bob's. The thing about these two is, unlike me, they really tried hard to stop drinking. I never really did try to stop drinking. You can't throw me out. I know my rights, but I did not have, I know that you can't make me leave now, but I did not have a desire to stop drinking when I got here. I just was hoping that you could tell me something, anything that would make me want to live. That's really all I was looking for. But Bill and Bob, oh my God, they tried so hard to quit drinking, but they just couldn't get it. Ebby had become a real distraction to his family in Albany. Remember, they're about politics and business, right? And he's embarrassing the family. His parents had died right after the stock market crash, and Ebby squandered a significant inheritance. He barely finished high school and never did any other education. And he was just kind of there's no nice way to put this. He kind of didn't do much of anything. You know, he'd piddle around in some of the family businesses, but then he'd do something stupid, get in trouble. You know, his drinking was out of control even then. And so they kind of encouraged Ebby to live in Manchester. They had a summer home in Manchester. They were very familiar with Manchester. So they encouraged him to, why don't you spend all the time in Manchester, not just the summer. And so that's what he did. And in Vermont, they have, at least they had, I don't know if they still do, they had 3 strikes and you're outlaw. I know some of you are probably familiar with that. You get 3 alcohol-related offenses, and you're getting locked up. You're either going to the nut house or the jailhouse for at least 6 months. You're going to one of those 2 places. That's just all there is to it. Now, I used to think that this was AA urban legend. Supposedly, Ebby drove his car into a house, you know, and the car was all the way into the house, in the kitchen. And this poor woman was just scared to death looking at him like that, and he demands a cup of coffee. You know, now this just smacked of AA urban legend to me, but sure enough, there it is. Let me see if I get my little fancy pointer here. He drives a Packard into a house, and then occupant then asks owner of the house for a cup of coffee. I like this headline over here. Totally unrelated, but this headline over here: Governor will be arrested on last day of office. Also, son. And there's a story there, I tell you. So I don't know what his first or second offense was, but this was one of them. So the third offense was, it's the early 30s now. His drinking's out of control. This is the summer home. Now, I was reading a book once, a history book by an author who I really respected, and they showed Ebby's summer home. It was a different house. I thought, oh my God, I'm a fraud. I've been showing people the wrong house. Well, it turns out that they had several houses and they had some rentals, but this was the house that they bought, that they owned, and this is the house where the story I'm about to tell you happened. Ebby, at some point, this was getting to be late in the summer of 34, he decided the house needed a little painting. So he hired somebody to help him do some painting. They did some painting together, and then the guy that he hired split. And he's out there admiring his work, and a couple of things started happening. One is a couple of birds came by, and they did what birds do on his nice, new, freshly painted house. He was not happy about that. And then it started to rain. Now he's really not happy. So he's about half gassed in a keen alcoholic mind. He goes in the house, he gets a shotgun. He comes out, and he's standing in the front yard, and he starts blasting away at these birds. Well, what he's doing is he's shooting up his house. That's what he's doing. The recoil from the shotgun was so strong, it just put him on his butt, and he's sitting on the wet grass. Blam, 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 blam. The neighbors don't like that. So they called the police, but Ebby was able to get the shotgun back in the house and leave. But it's a small town. The constable caught up with him the next day. It was a guy he went to school with. He knew him. So anyway, they take him in front of the judge, and the judge says, "Can you stay sober till Monday?" And Ebby says, "Well, of course I can." I mean, really, I couldn't make it a day. I remember when they told me, what we found is it's the first drink that gets you drunk. I said, one drink never got me drunk. Well, when's the last time you drank one drink? I said, oh, you guys are pretty smart. Then they gave me that old tried and true AA line. They said, you can stay away from one drink for one day, can't you? And I said, sure I can. I don't know why I thought I could. I'd never been able to do it before. But they asked, Ebby, can you make it through the weekend? He said, sure, yeah, not a problem. And one of the first little miracles, he says, you come back Monday morning and you be sober. One of the first miracles, or one of the many, many miracles, you might say, is there was some booze still at the house. And Ebby almost drank it. He almost drank it, but he didn't. He went and he gave it to a neighbor. But he is scared to death. He doesn't know what's going to happen to him. He's going to wind up in a place called the Brattleboro Asylum. I took that picture up top there, and of course the bottom one's very, very old. When I was up there, I like to say, when I was in Vermont doing research, really, I was just up there on a trip. But I thought, man, I'm going to go by the Brattleboro, see what's there now. And I thought, well, probably be some sort of strip mall or some condominiums, or if it is a hospital, it's probably some big new facility. Man, it looks just like that. It's exactly the same, but not exactly the same. Instead of being the Brattleboro Asylum, it is now called the Brattleboro Retreat. So I park my car and I get out and I'm walking around. I'm taking pictures of some of these really, creepy but kind of cool old buildings. Waiting for security to come rolling up on me, but they never did. I guess I looked like I belonged there. And anyway, I found out there was an AA meeting there later that evening. So, man, I was excited. I went in, I got a little something to eat in town, and then I came back for the meeting. And we're sitting in this, dank, drab, like olive green, brown tile floor that's peeling up, pipes in the ceiling. And there's all these psych patients sitting in a circle on chairs, nodding off of their chairs. And I'm just going on and on about the history of this place. Ebby was almost sent here, and Bill and Ebby, blah, 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 blah. I couldn't understand why they weren't sharing my enthusiasm. But, you're really into AA history when you're excited to be at a place where Ebby was almost sent to. Because it turns out he didn't get sent there after all. So what happened? All right, these men you see here, Roland we're already familiar with, Shep C, non-alcoholic, Sebra G, definitely an alcoholic. What these three men had in common is they all came from wealthy families, and all of their families had summer homes in Manchester. And so, along with Ebby's family. So all of these men knew each other, and Roland had been an Oxford group member for a while now. And he and Shep became an Oxford group member, as did Sebra, and Sebra was not drinking at the time. So they've heard about Ebby's escapades and his troubles, and they did like we do, They just kind of stopped by and visited him. How you doing, Ebby? How's everything? You know how we react when the pressure ain't on. Oh, I'm doing fine, and then they start talking to him about the Oxford group. Man, he don't want to hear. Get away from me. I'm fine. Get out of here. Well, they found out that he was in trouble, so they thought, this is an opportunity. Maybe he'll be a little more receptive. And they were right. He was very receptive. And so if you're about to be sentenced to 6 months someplace, it's a real advantage if you happen to be friends with the judge's son, because the judge in the case was Sebra's father. And so Roland, being the only adult among them, Shep and Sebra were like Bill's age, and Roland was like Dr. Bob's age. Dr. Bob went to Judge Graves and just asked him, would you parole Ebby to me? And the judge agreed to do it. And I don't know if this ever happened to you, but I was set free a few times and told to leave immediately. If we see you here tomorrow, you're in trouble. So he left. They paroled Ebby to Roland. They stayed in Vermont for a little while, and then they went on to New York City, and Ebby stayed a couple of different places. And then he wound up in a place called the Calvary Mission. This would be now late summer, early fall of 1934. And the Calvary Mission was one of the early urban missions, and it was run by none other than our very own Reverend Sam Shoemaker. He had been appointed to the Calvary Church sometime in the 20s, and Sam felt very strongly that the church had an obligation to help the homeless, to help the drunks. They weren't calling us alcoholics. We were just drunks. We were just drunks, inebriates, imbibers, and all that stuff. And a lot of these Manhattan churches would support, food banks and shelters and things like that and missions, but they wouldn't get their hands dirty. They would just give money. Sam was different. He got involved, and when he took over Calvary Church, this right here, what would become, it's right there. It was called the Calvary Chapel, and it was all boarded up. And he ran into a guy, and he wanted to make it a mission, and so that's what they did. And so Ebby would eventually wind up at this mission, which had a large Oxford group influence. And by this time, Sam Shoemaker had become the de facto head of U.S. operations for the Oxford group. He and Frank Buchman would eventually split. That's outside of the scope of this presentation. But at this time, he was the de facto head of the U.S. operations for the Oxford group, which by this point was worldwide. I mean, we're talking the cover of magazines, big publicity. Everybody knew about the Oxford group. And so Ebby's there I go with that old guy again. Ebby's thinking one day, by now it's November of 1934. Bill had periods of sobriety, but he went on his last drunk, Armistice Day, 1934. And Ebby had heard stories about Bill. He'd heard the horrible things that had happened in his life. And he thought maybe I'll pay a visit on my old friend Bill, see how he's doing. The stories of Bill and Ebby's drinking escapades are exaggerated. They did do a little bit of drinking together, and I'm still a little jumpy. They did do a little drinking together, and they did have some escapades, but not nearly as much as we're led to believe. But they were fond of each other. They were good friends, and they definitely did some drinking together. By this time, and this would be November of 1934, like I said, Bill had made a fortune and lost it twice. He was just a hopeless, chronic alcoholic. He had tried everything to stop drinking. By this time, he's unemployable. The depression had hit. The house you see there on the right, 182 Clinton Street, was the house that his wife Lois was born in. Her father was a physician. He was no longer living there. When Lois's mother died, Bill was so drunk he couldn't even make the funeral. Lois was working in a department store because Bill was unemployable, and the only reason they weren't put out was there was a moratorium on foreclosures because of the depression. Otherwise, they'd have been out on the streets. Bill's drinking had progressed to a point where he shook violently all the time. They were so worried about him that they pulled a mattress from upstairs and they pulled it downstairs and put it on the floor because they were afraid he would either jump out or fall out of one of the upper story windows. He would routinely lose control of his bodily functions, and he would wake up to the stench and the shame and the humiliation of that. In the morning when Lois would be getting ready for work, he would pretend like he was still asleep because he couldn't bear to look at her. And then when she would leave, he'd start scrounging around the house looking for something to drink. This is the condition our co-founder was in when Ebby decided to call on his old friend Bill. And so he does. He gives him a call, come on over. Bill thinks they're going to do some drinking together, and he was surprised when Ebby refused to drink. I have all the respect in the world for AA's official birth date of June 10th, 1935, but in my mind, and you could say this about a bunch of other times as well, AA was born at that kitchen table in Brooklyn, New York in late November 1934, when Ebby made the point-blank declaration that God had done for him what he could not do for himself. Now we're going to see if Bill will tell us what happened that day if he cooperates.
So presently, he's in the kitchen at Clinton Street. Sober. I hadn't known of his being sober in New York for years. I said to him, "What about a drink, Ebby?" "No," he said, "I'm not drinking." I said, "Are you on the water wagon?" "No, I'm just not drinking today." I said, "What's got into you, my friend?" And looking at me, he said simply and smilingly, "I've got religion." Ah, what a jarring thought that was. Well, one had to be polite. I said, what brand of religion have you got? He said I wouldn't call it a religion at all. The religion of common sense, perhaps. I met up with a group of people, and I drew from them certain essential ideas about a way of life that did the job for me. And here is what I did. I got honest with myself as never before. I talked over my personality defects with another in confidence. I visited the people I had harmed and made restitution, thereby sweeping away the debris of the past. And he said, Bill, I know that you're a very skeptical one. This may jar you. But I found that I couldn't make that simple program of living work until I asked God, as I understood God, to help me.
I've heard Bill in different talks describe this scene a bunch of times. One of the things he says it was like he got hit in the face with a wet mop. You know, anybody that, we know Bill's story. He wasn't too keen on this whole God idea. Maybe he wasn't a stone-cold atheist, and well, in fact, he wasn't. But, God wasn't doing nothing for him, and he just assumed not having anything to do with God. So God was not in the picture. And now here's Ebby. The evidence is before him, right? Ebby didn't have to set up identification because they drank together. He knew. And now Bill, bleary-eyed, shaken, unshaven, just a hopeless wreck of a person, is across the table from a guy who is clean, smells good, his eyes are clear, and he's just saying, God did this for me. I always love in Bill's story when it says, and Ebby said, well, I'll tell you how I got this way if you're interested. And it's like, yeah, man, that was good. We didn't have a 12-step then, but that was the perfect 12-step call. No preaching, no lecturing. I just care about my old friend. If you're interested in how I've overcome drinking and the changes I've made in my life, I'm happy to share it with you. If not, that's okay. The perfect 12-step call. We don't hear about some other visits that Ebby made. A few days later, Ebby comes with the guy Shep, who was not an alcoholic. And there's a little bit of a pecking order in our group, and Ebby was the junior guy. So Shep says, stand aside, I'll show you how we do this. And they go in there, and they do everything we're not supposed to do. Shep starts preaching and lecturing and banging the table and pointing, and Bill became infuriated. He said he was boastful and obnoxious and probably never even really did any drink. He couldn't stand this guy. He couldn't wait to get him out of there. I mean, Ebby had just done the perfect 12-step call and really got Bill's attention, and then Shep comes and just tears it all down with all the things we're not supposed to do. And so Bill literally throws him out, gets him to the door really quick. See you later. Don't call me. I'll call you. And he goes, I love how we hurt ourselves when we're mad at somebody else. Bill goes back into the kitchen and he said, I really punished that bottle of gin, And I can't help but think, opinion alert here, that even in Bill's alcohol-soaked mind, he's already formulating ideas about what worked and what didn't work. Founding moment number 3, Bill's spiritual experience, Towns Hospital. Charles Towns is an interesting character. He was not a MD, probably never even finished high school. He was born in Georgia in 1862. Georgia 1862 was a tough place to be. A guy named Gary Neidhart wrote what I think is the only biography of Charlie Towns. He was an archivist down in Georgia. He's a good guy. I'm not trying to sell books, but if you want to know all things Charles Towns, there you go. Where he became so interested in helping first opium addicts and then alcoholics is unknown. How he hit on a really effective detox regimen is unknown, but he did. And he was doing some good work in China, and he comes back to the U.S. and he opens up Towns Hospital, which it was just a building with a lot of rooms in it, and it became rather popular. So Bill had been to Towns Hospital a couple of times already. His brother-in-law, Lois's brother, was a physician, and he had heard about Towns Hospital. So Bill had been detoxed there at least twice, maybe 3 times. So he had met this wonderful man, William D. Silkworth, the little doctor who loved drunks. If you're a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous, it's not an exaggeration or being dramatic to say you literally owe your life to this guy. He was an incredibly compassionate and wise man. He had some financial difficulties as a result of the stock market crash, and towns just snatched him up and had him work for him. He was just an incredible guy, Back in those days, here's how they treated us. They strapped us down. They pumped all kinds of drugs into us. They gave us crude lobotomies. They sterilized us. Then they would turn us out on the street. And you know what we would do. We go right to the liquor store. It was willful misconduct in most people's eyes in those days. Dr. Silkworth was different. He saw these people just going mad for a drink, and he knew they were sick. This is not self-will. This is not misconduct. These people are really, really sick. They can't help themselves. They're up against something that they can't fight alone. So he was very compassionate with alcoholics, and he tried very hard to help them. Where he became so interested in alcoholics is really unknown. His father was in the Civil War, and when he came home, he was appalled at the alcoholism that he saw in the troops. Maybe that had something to do with it, I don't know. But if you were to meet Dr. Silkworth, everybody said the same thing about him. They said when you met Dr. Silkworth, you knew you were in the presence of somebody very special, and you were in the presence of somebody who cared. So thank God for Dr. Silkworth. So now Bill's got this belly full of booze and a head full of AA, even though AA isn't here yet, and he's wandering around drunk the streets of New York for a couple of weeks. He went up to the Mission and checked it out, even went up to the rail, and he's a mess. He's a total mess. And so he figures, well, I think if they got this big cure that they're talking about, that Abby and the Oxford group and all those people have, one last detox is in order. So let's Bill tell you what happened.
Well, I started for Towns Hospital, and on the way I bought a bottle. You know, it is customary with us who are about to be cured for the last time to get terribly stewed. Arrived there, I waved the bottle over my head and shouted drunkenly at good old Dr. Silkworth, "This time, Doc, I've got something."
Ooh, I got something. I'll bet you do. So it just broke Dr. We're going to break real soon, so just don't worry, guys. Hang in there. We're going to break in a minute. He coming through the door waving a bottle of beer, ranting about having found the answer. And this just broke Dr. Silkworth's heart. He just put his arm around him and said, "Well, I'm sure you have, my boy. Let's get you upstairs." And so the detox regimen would begin. And after a few days, Bill is laying in his hospital bed. The worst of it is over. Now it's just a matter of regaining strength. And then something happened. We'll let Bill explain it.
Rebelling a little still, I sunk into a deeper and deeper depression. And in the bottom of that pit, I suppose the last trace of my obstinacy was crushed out. I was, in fact, a child crying in the dark. And I said, as you have said, now I will do anything to get well. And then, with no hope, no faith at all, I cried out, if there is a God, will he show himself? My experience was granted to me very suddenly. It seemed to me that place lit up in a great white light. In the mind's eye, I seemed to be on a mountaintop. A great wind is blowing, and I know it is not of air, but of spirit. There are no words to describe those minutes.
Ooh, that's kind of a big deal, isn't it? Earlier in one of his hospitalizations, Bill overheard Dr. Silkworth explaining to Lois what exactly will happen to him if he doesn't stop drinking. He was basically describing what a wet brain was and how Bill was going to have to be locked up if he was going to live. That was just all there was. That's something that Bill was absolutely terrified. He and his father were in Brattleboro once when he was a small child, and they walked by the Brattleboro Asylum. And what Bill saw in the yard there as he looked through the iron gates just scared him to death. He saw these patients walking around, bumping into each other, screaming at each other. One of them took all his clothes off and went running off, and the orderlies tackled him and carried him away screaming. So Bill was terrified about that. So now you got this spiritual experience. We got white lights. We got the wind of air, of grace, not of air, and on a mountaintop and all that. And as he's coming down from that, he's scared. He is scared. And he did a really smart thing. He asked if he could talk to Dr. Silkworth. And how easy it would have been for a weary Dr. Silkworth to simply say, I just hit him up with some barbiturates. I don't have time. I'm busy. But no, Dr. Silkworth came to his room and he sat down next to his bed. And Bill recounted exactly what had just happened to him. And then he asked the $1 million question, am I mad? Have I lost my mind? And Dr. Silkworth says, no, my boy. In my estimation, you're perfectly sane. I'm a simple man of science. I don't understand such things, but I have seen them before. I can't explain what's happened to you, but whatever it is, you'd better hang on to it. It's so much better than what you had just a while ago. The next day, Bill couldn't remember who. He thinks it was Ebby, brought him a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. William James, another one of these iconic figures in modern psychology, Harvard guy all his life. One of the things I love about AA is we don't use $50 words where a $5 word will do. That's really good for a guy like me. So the best way I can describe the book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, is it's like a Harvard version of our book, Came to Believe. That's all there is to it. Bill just devoured that book, and he recognized certain things that were similar in all of those spiritual experiences. Intense, prolonged pain, a complete crushing of the ego, a helplessness and a hopelessness that is beyond description that made a spiritual experience possible. And Lois remembers, she writes, the minute I saw him at the hospital, I knew something had happened. Three of the biggest words in AA. His eyes were filled with light. His whole being expressed joy and hope. From that moment on, I shared his confidence in the future. I never doubted that at last he was free. So we're going to take a break now, y'all. And by the way, we're like 2/3 of the way through, so the next part won't be this long. I promise you. See you in 10 minutes.